Cruise ship workers of Reddit, what was the biggest oh crap moment on the boat that luckily passengers didn't find out about at all? No, the house band doesn't care if you are the second coming of Eric Clapton. We aren't going to invite you on stage to hear your version of C. Just relax and enjoy yourself. Yes, we sometimes have bad nights. Playing 3-4 hour sets 5 nights a week for months on end does leave some room for us to not be on our A game sometimes. Just relax and enjoy the show. Welp, looks like we need to cut the set short tonight, kids. The drummer just had a heart attack. Be sure to tip the waitress. The DJ will be right up to keep the music going. My dad worked on a cruise liner in the 80s. When it was in the Falklands as a troop carrier, it was nearly sunk by a French Exocet missile fired by the Argentinians. I believe it was closer than 100 meters before it was destroyed. Another time one of the engineers discovered a fire in the engine room, and so as not to cause too much of a panic by sounding the alarm, he ran around the middeck shouting "Fii in the main engine room and then ran back downstairs. Finally, another fire was once discovered by a boiler technician who, whilst not on duty and drunk, put it out with his makeshift male firefighting equipment. I'm so glad the boiler tech was well prepared. I haven't worked on a cruise, but I did go on a Disney cruise in February. Obviously we knew this happened, since I can tell the story. As an aside, the cruise was amazing, and even though Disney cruises cost more, ours was entirely done with rewards points. The ship never had lines for anything and the staff was beyond incredible. Anyway, a small electrical fire broke out in a cabin down the hall from us. It's jolting being woken up on a cruise by a general alarm and opening the cabin door to see a crewman sprinting down the hall with a fire extinguisher. The ship's captain quickly walked past as well, with a couple officers flanking him. A few minutes later they had crew stationed throughout the ship's halls, explaining to everyone what had happened and that everything was fine. The family that had been in the cabin got moved elsewhere, and at the next port it seemed like they brought in extra people to clean the floor to remove the smell. It was mild anyway. Fires on ships are scary, and the response is always immediate and probably proportionally larger than it needs to be. My father was a firefighter on his cruiser when he was in the Navy, and he had similar stories. Ships don't frick around when it comes to fire. Ships don't frick around when it comes to fire. If I remember correctly, fire is among the biggest risks to ships at sea, mostly because there's nowhere to go if it really gets going. Only one I have witnessed were 2 fires in the engine rooms. Scary thought. Because of the nature of the ship's normal workers are picked to be firefighter trained. So your onboard firefighters will be engineers or wait staff or galley men. They chose the big bulky ones who won't be blown over when the water comes out the hose. Hubs and I went on the Oriana to the top of Norway for our honeymoon this February-March. Thoroughly recommended. But when we were in Alta, so 70 degrees north, it was -15 during the day and got down to -27 both nights we were there. Pretty cold. In fact, so cold that the poor old girl had her pipes freeze. The electrics go out. They were cooking lunch in the dark using guys with torches. Captain Gray even said later that he checked Oriana's logs and she'd never endured colder than -10 in Alta before then. Then worse as we were heading back south and hit the North Atlantic current, which was -6 and so melted all those frozen pipes. Some flights of stairs and a little mini buffet were closed because of water damage, and they did say on disembarkation, if you're a plumber, please stay. My housemate's sister works for Carnival and mentioned to me they'd had an emergency meeting about Oriana's predicament. Currently working on a ship sailing out of NYC. Just a few months ago we had a passenger go through a breakup with his girlfriend over the phone while on board. He went to his mother's cabin, told her goodbye, and before anyone could do anything about it he ran up to deck 15 and jumped about 150 feet into the water. The rescue boats searched for hours and never recovered the body. Everyone assumed he got sucked under the ship and into the propulsion system. Protocol is not to tell other passengers more than they need to know in the event of an emergency, so we all had to keep quiet. Also on decks TT-1 through 2 there are a bunch of watertight doors that divide up the different compartments that have several tons of force behind them when closing. They will stop at pretty much nothing when set to close. We once had a contracted mechanic on board doing some temporary work and he dropped a tool on the wrong side of a closing watertight door. He reached back to grab it and his arm proceeded to get stuck and the door closed on his shoulder. Totally sliced off his arm and he bled out and died before someone found him. I don't work on a cruise ship but on a ro-ro ship that can take a few passengers. We got complaints one day of the toilets in one of the passenger cabins not flushing. After the engineers spent hours flushing out the sewage system to get into the right pipes, turned out the only couple on board had been dumping all their condoms down the toilet, which had clogged the whole system. Finally, something I can comment on. I work as a contractor on cruise ships and jump between ships all throughout the year. I've done 18 cruises in the last year, and being a contractor I get a lot of interaction with guests and crew. The crew is trained in virtually every possible situation you can imagine and have required drills every week. There is quite a bit of death on board and there is a morgue on most ships I work on. A lot of suicides that nobody catches until someone reports them missing and you hear they jumped in the middle of the night. In fact, I've been on board when they had more deaths than they had room for, so they threw a surprise ice cream party for the crew so they could make room in a separate freezer. But what actually was the craziest experience for me on board was when we lost satellite the night of the last election, and when everyone woke up we got it back and the results were just in. I've never seen a more divided ship amongst guests. Arguments, parties, fist fights. It was 8 AM. where we were at the time, and it's definitely a weird way to start a day at sea. We also had a guest get stuck on a mountain in Alaska and we had to call in air support before we could leave to get them back. And my favorite story to tell is when I was saying the Red Sea we had armed security on board and they just stood and watched the water in case of pirates. We had required lights out and curtains closed after 6 PM for our own protection, and it was always fun to see a tiny army ready to fight pirates at any given moment. Those dudes could drink. Worked on a ship where the center pod up and died due to contaminated lubricating oil. A friend on the engineering staff said that from the time they noticed the temperature change to complete fuba was less than 10 seconds. Did the company replace it? No. Divers stripped the blades off the prop next turnaround day and they left it that way for the next 6 months. Driddick is expensive. Y'all ran the other two props at 110% and shortened our port stays to compensate for the reduced speed. Never mind what would have happened if we'd lost another one in the middle of a storm. Brand new ship, too. Used to leak through the front shell gates when we crossed the Bay of Biscay. I'm sure the guests wouldn't have been happy to see 3 inches of water sloshing back and forth on the luggage deck every cruise. I've worked on cruise ships English and American for 13 years and I have some great stories and some pretty sad stories. The one I'm about to tell didn't happen to me though. It happened to a friend who is still a cruise director to this day. I'll call him CD. CD was strolling along a guest corridor when he came across an old man sitting outside his cabin on the floor. When he asked the gentleman if everything was okay, the man just looked up and shook his head. CD asks what the problem was and the old gentleman said, "My wife's in bed. I think she's passed away." CD calls security and they enter the room to find his elderly wife had in fact passed and couldn't be resuscitated. She was pronounced and all the wheels are put into motion to take the body off the following day, and he would be helped with all the arrangements to help get him and his wife's body back home. The following, the man told staff that he would like to stay for the rest of the cruise and it's what his wife would have wanted. The company allowed for the body to remain in the unbowed morgue until they arrived back at the home port a few days later. Apparently the guy won bingo, attended the captain's cocktail in formal dress and was seen to be really enjoying the remainder on the cruise. I work on a passenger ferry. We found some guns being smuggled into the country. Had to keep that quiet. Kind of hard to do with police dogs on board. Red parties is not a party you weren't invited to. It means fire. Blue parties is still not a party. It's a flood. And the call for Mr. Mob. They're not calling for a man whose surname is Mob. They're calling out that there has been a man overboard. Mob. Enjoy your cruise with your newfound knowledge. I know I'm a little late, but I have such a good one for this. One of our spa attendants lost it. I mean seriously lost it. He had worked for the ship for years and was slowly building a kill list of employees that he was planning to kill. He was slowly sending himself a gun in pieces so that it wasn't caught by ship security in incoming packages, and was nearly done when his roommate found the list. I was on a Disney cruise last year, transatlantic. And one night there was a special code that came blaring into our room, whatever Disney's secret fire code is. Too lazy to look it up, they never came back on to tell guests what it was about. People above me thought the ship was sinking. I heard them run for their life vests, closet doors slamming. I peek out into the hallway, dazed and confused passengers. I got online to look up the code and learned it was a fire code. To make a long story short, there was a fire in one of the restaurants. I'm going to assume that they had to call the code into the staterooms because, you know, there was a freaking fire on the ship in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. If they come on and say fire, people will panic and there would be mass chaos. But the fact that they never bothered to follow up on the code tells me in the case of a real emergency, we dead. I still love to cruise. 10/10 will do it again. This story proves why updates to the passengers are so important. The ship I am on will broadcast the status of the fire every 10 minutes or so if needed. The captain will assure the guests with the process made. Imagination is almost always way worse than information. I once was working loading a cruise ship and a man with a warrant once jumped off the side of the ship into the Hudson River, swam to the west side highway and hailed a cab just to avoid getting arrested. Police were waiting for him to come through customs. I worked on a cruise ship in Hawaii. One time we ran out of rice and the Filipino employees refused to work until we got more. We made an emergency port on Oahu and got more. I don't think anyone noticed except for the kitchen crew. I was one of those events no one found out about. I went on a cruise when I was really sick BC. I thought I was dying and wanted one last hurrah with my husband. I ended up becoming paralyzed during a meal on the ship. The waiter was so discreet and they had a whole protocol to deal with it. I don't think any diners around even caught on. Everyone I interacted with remained calm and very polite. The shipboard doctor was surprisingly good. Made me realize with how many old and sick people that cruise there are lots of medical emergencies of all types probably on many cruises. And they are completely equipped and prepared to deal with a lot of them efficiently and discreetly. On another cruise, one of the excursions was a private plane scenic tour. It was popular. One of the planes crashed and it took a while to learn that it was carrying passengers from another ship that was in port. Really put a damper on the rest of the cruise for everyone. Though, that one wasn't kept a secret. Getting the call at 2 AM to prepare the lifeboats because there was a fire in the engine room. From what I could find out, the ship was 7 minutes from calling a evacuation because of this situation. Much beer was had the next day. Sorry I am a couple hours late to the party, but I worked on ships for about 4 years and witnessed a lot of what was already said. The one that stuck out to me was an embarkation day in Miami. On embarkation day, all the public areas of the ship are open like the theater, spa, gym, etc. so new passengers can see them and get settled in, but mostly so we could sell them packages. An older man was checking out the gym, in regular clothes, jeans, Hawaiian shirt, flip-flops probably, and decided to go for a run on the treadmill. He had a heart attack and died right there in the gym before the cruise even started. Because we were still in port, Miami PD and the coroner had to come on and investigate, etc. The problem was the gym and treadmills on this ship had a huge glass wall to the pool deck. Who knows how many people witnessed him die before the crew had a chance to close down the space. The crew simply closed the pool area and gym, the coroner took the body, and the crew set sail a few hours late. No announcement was ever made. A teenage girl and her 10-ish-year-old brother had a serious argument on an open deck at night. She was much bigger than him. She picked him up by his throat and held him over the side of the ship. We were doing a Baltic run and between some ports with serious distance between them. So the ship was sailing around 26 kts and it was pitch black. Security happened upon them while this was happening and, thank God, prevented an either intentional or accidental Oscar man overboard. The girl was kept in the brig until morning, and the family was disembarked and repatriated immediately. It was actual crap. Stranded on the ocean with our sewage system backed up. Never go on a cruise. Oh yeah, the passengers did find out about that one. Had a crew member jump overboard. January 2012, Monarch of the Seas. Not sure how much the guests knew, but we all heard Oscar 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 starboard side and knew it wasn't a drill. Poor bloke. My 6-month contract went uneventful for the most part. While we were crossing the Atlantic, leaving the Mediterranean and heading for the Caribbean, an older passenger got deathly ill, so much so that we had to detour and hand him off near Bermudas. Obviously his family and friends knew, but the detour went unnoticed by the rest of the passengers. Also, the casino manager got crap-faced in Venice, missed the ship, and caught up in Santorini. He somehow managed to board before the ship set sail. I worked as an ordinary seaman with NCL in Hawaii for 5 months. I had all kinds of responsibilities that changed all the time depending on which officer felt like a big boy that day. Working with the night washdown crew, we would see people having sex in the hot tubs almost every night, and they didn't know that everyone on the bridge, engine room, and security room watching them too using the cameras. When I was maintaining the chemical levels in the pools and hot tubs, I noticed how often kids and adults would crap in them. They would immediately have to be cleaned, but it took time to get the pH levels correct for each pool, and a few times people had their hair discolored by the chemicals when they tried to just lift the rope set up to keep them out just because they wanted in the hot tub right that instant. Then there was the crappy chief mate that took my pH level logs and doctored them right before a big audit. Then there were all the STDs passing around the 1,000 crew members. Those are just a few of the stories. I worked on one for a year. During a rehearsal in the main auditorium, one of the dancers got his foot caught in the crack of the hydraulic platform that raises up and down. Because some of the safety sensors were broken, the lift completely shut and sucked his foot into the space between the platform and the stage, which was about a centimeter. I was friends with a lot of the dancers who witnessed it, and they were pretty shook up from the screams. After they got him stabilized, the captain came on and told us we were making a stop in Cabo so he could be flown back to the States for emergency surgery. I felt so bad for him. It was his first contract and he was so excited to be there. A cruise ship I worked on had just had a refit in Driddock, with brand new furnishings. They had hung a giant chandelier over the main lobby atrium, which was actually installed by a company who doesn't do work for cruise ships. The result? They used the wrong size fixing bolts that were unable to take the force of the ship's movement in a swaying 2-ton chandelier, and these bolts sheared and the chandelier fell down onto the atrium deck at approx 2 AM in the morning. Luckily it happened at the time that it did, as they hold all the events there during the day, such as cocktail parties, fashion shows, art auctions, etc. This would have caused fatalities if the timing were different. I worked on a cruise ship in guest services and we would deal with a lot of crazy people. One of the craziest things to happen was when we found immigrants from Cuba floating on a life raft in the middle of the ocean. We had to bring them all on board and keep them in crew area until the Coast Guard came to get them. We basically told guests they would be off the ship by morning, but people were freaking out. The Coast Guard came in the middle of the night and then they were gone. Also, GI breakouts are really bad on ships. Wash your hands, people. I worked on ships for 3 years and boy, the stories you hear about or live through, this one takes the cake. Though, my colleague in the kids center who we all found creepy AF is now a convicted sexual predator serving 14 years. The ship always needs a certain number of crew members on board, so when it's your week cruise to be a designated crew member, your passport and it are confiscated, so you literally cannot leave the ship. Not sure if your post has actually been removed or if this will ever be seen, but I'll try to answer. I cruise quite a lot and have seen quite a few things so far, including bad storms, which are always fun. I only cruise on small vessels usually. The crew aren't as happy as you think they are. Last month I was out on deck and heard someone talking. It was the ship's cruise director, and he was Skyping his family, wife and 2 young daughters. It was his birthday, and he said he wouldn't celebrate until he got back home to England. Just remember, he had to be on the ship another 6 months before seeing his family. Just imagine arriving back at port, knowing you're about 100 miles from your family, but not being able to see them for ages. His daughters didn't want him to leave, but he had to go. He was even getting tearful. He hung up, then had to go back inside to put on the same happy, enthusiastic show as he does every night of his life. Let's see. Leaving Southampton to New York, we took the exact path that Titanic did. During winter, sailed through a hurricane north of Germany. We were surprisingly close to tipping over. In a few places machinery weighing thousands of pounds came off their moorings and slid around. The shortest time it took for someone to die on board, 45 minutes. I am not kidding. We were still in sight of Miami and turned around to drop off the stiff fire, often in a laundry room because dumbass crew like to put things like shoes or overload the dryers. Also, ironically, a lot of uncontrolled fires inside the incinerator. Don't smoke in your rooms, especially if you've gone to a place like Mexico where certain things are legal. Bringing something with you can have you prosecuted as an international drug smuggler. Speaking of, on my first tour on a cruise ship, a fellow crewman was found with a 5-pound brick of pot. He was fired. The pot incinerated. Nothing else. Guy was not reported to any police agency because of the potential bad press. Others may make it sound like a non-stop party for crew, but by law we aren't allowed to ever go above 08 back while on board. Not while working. While living there. Is security rather lax about this? Yeah, but not everyone wants to risk being fired and kicked off the ship in a strange country, which is what happens with crewman DUI. Zero tolerance. Oh yes, I almost forgot this story. I was friends with the youth staff on board. Early in one week they had this 12-year-old kid come to them. Problem is 12 is not 13 and absolutely cannot join the teens group. Insurance thing. He's 12 but 6 feet 1 inches. Parents get mad, leave their younger daughter, but the 12-year-old declines playing in the kids group. During that vacation, that 12-year-old was arrested for attempted kidnapping, a 30-year-old woman, sexual assault, and attempted rape. The youth staff I worked with were both relieved and freaking out. What if we did let him in the teen group and uncle stayed with the younger sister on board while the parents stayed behind to deal with their son? Story 1. I worked on a cruise ship at the front desk. One afternoon the desk received dozens of reports of a man overboard. As we were passing by an especially scenic area, there were a lot of people out on the decks and balconies to see this person in the water. Of course, the ship did a 180 and sent boats out to find the person. The person they find was the ship's safety officer, who, while exhausted, was okay. Everyone assumed that the ship's safety officer jumped in after the person, so other boats kept looking. Though, as it turned out, the officer was having an especially rough day and thought that would solve his problems. Guests assumed it was a passenger in a bathrobe, seeing his white uniform, and we let them think that. Story 2. I was working the overnight shift at the front desk and the ship's emergency alarm goes off at midnight while we are at sea. This is the one that means passengers must go to their emergency muster stations and only used in extreme emergencies. From what I heard, the crew decks were absolute mayhem, including crew members seen running down the crew halls in their underwear trying to get back to their cabins to get in their emergency gear. Crew members were literally preparing lifeboats in case the captain ordered an abandoned ship. In the end, it was realized that the alarm only sounded in crew areas while passengers slept soundly in their cabins completely oblivious. As it turns out, someone on the bridge forgot to silence a silly alarm, which resulted in the alarm going off by accident. Why it is designed that way, who knows? Don't want to say the name of the ship, but it rhymes with cervical ablation. This was 15 years ago. About 2 days in there was a pretty consistent noise and vibration that made it difficult to sleep. I had been on the ship before, so I chalked it up to just being in a different location and decided to just deal. There was an announcement that we would be making an extra stop for some type of mechanical repair. By about day 5 I noticed there was a slight list in the ship, but there were no addition stops or announcements. I asked one of the crew who I had talked to before and he said there was nothing to inform us about. On the last day when we were departing I asked him again what had happened. He just smiled and said, "You don't want to know. Be happy we're back in port." To this day I know the dang ship was listing and I'll never know why. I was on cruise about 12 years ago as a passenger and we were off the coast of Mexico leaving a port. I do not remember which one. All of a sudden the ship started shaking really bad. Things started falling off shelves and it was really scary. We thought we hit a reef or something. The next day the captain announced over the PA that we had gone over the epicenter of a 8 magnitude earthquake. The port we found out later had been basically destroyed. No big oh crap moment during my time working aboard, but I do recall them having a dive team periodically go down under the ship to check for explosive devices, and guests just thought, "Oh look dear, they have divers." My first week on the ship, a crew member committed suicide. The captain announced over the ship PA that there was an unexpected death of a crew member, but didn't mention the circumstances. The guests knew someone had died and that the crew was taking over the theater for a memorial, but not how he died. The guests were more upset that it disrupted their vacation. Didn't actually work on the cruise ship, but went on a cruise when I was in college for a class trip. We could only afford cabins way down in the bowels of the ship, next to the crew quarters. A lot of them were college-age kids too, so we got along well. Was up on the top deck one day catching some sun, and over the speakers we calmly hear code 10. Top deck. Code 10. We looked around and didn't see anything out of the ordinary. Went back to relaxing. That night we were talking to some of the college crew and they said that some older lady slipped getting out of a hot tub, tumbled over the side of it and smacked her head, killing her. The crew was on it super quick and basically none of the passengers knew about it beside their immediate family. They really keep things hush hush on those things. Former cruise ship employee. I was 19 and put in charge of a section in case of emergency evacuations. It was supposed to be my job to direct people to lifeboats. Yeah, I never went to my post. I was an AV guy. I had no training for emergency situations at the time. I wandered around an empty ship during drills before departure. Yeah, so if there was an emergency, better hope you weren't in my lazy butt 19-year-old section or you were fricked. This was 10 years ago. I've since developed a more professional work ethic. Almost the same. Also an AV guy, but about age 26. Managed to get an exemption because I had to film the passengers during the lifeboat drill because it was absolutely the best way to film as many of them at once. And people bought the videos if they were in the preview of them. So my motivations were much more profit oriented than laziness. Oh goody, I get to finally provide a comment on a popular thread. Used to work for Princess. During one cruise, we had 4 passengers die from flu. The ship was considering going into quarantine at sea, but luckily, we didn't. One time in Chivy, the gateway to Rome, there was a crew excursion to Rome. It was supposed to be all day and get back right before all aboard. Someone committed suicide on the train tracks, so it held back that whole group. 10 minutes before all aboard, hundreds of crew members burst out of the Chivy train station and ran toward the ship. It was like something out of 28 Days Later. They mobbed up the gangway. People were throwing their C-passes forward to have them scanned before the deadline. Very little leniency for being late. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.